I know that senior executives control the working lives of millions of people. If one employee's life at work is better, they have a better relationship with their partner, with their children, with their community, and that ripple just keeps going. Work is so central to the human condition, and if we can make it work for people, oh, what a gift. Every executive, you've got the opportunity to hand that gift to somebody.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Okay, let's talk about the topic on everyone's mind, the Great Resignation. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, an enormous number of people have left their jobs. And so far, it doesn't show signs of slowing. The pandemic reshaped the workforce as we know it. So how can both companies and employees adapt and thrive in this new environment? Today, I'm joined by behavioral scientist, psychologist, and futurist Aaron McEwan. Aaron believes that businesses must place people at the center of what they do if they're going to stay competitive in the marketplace. Aaron's the VP of Research and Advisory for Garden's HR practice, where he provides advice to the world's leading companies on the future of work and talent. Aaron was recently named a top 100 global HR influencer and one of the 5 HR leaders to follow in 2022. He was also a member of Innovation Nation, which was a cross-industry initiative sponsored by the Office of the Prime Minister to elevate Australia's reputation for entrepreneurship and innovation. In this episode, Aaron and I talk about the future of workplaces and what happens when companies can no longer rely on culture and on-premise experience to attract and retain talent. We talk about the challenges of understanding employees, the role personalization might play in the future, and the purpose of traditional office spaces, among other things. Aaron was a pleasure to talk with. As always, I feel like we covered a lot of ground in our 45 minutes together, and I really enjoy the conversation. I hope you do too. And now I bring you Aaron McEwan. Hi, everybody. I'm here with Aaron McEwan. Aaron, welcome to Work for Humans. So happy to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
You, out of absolutely everybody I know, talks on a monthly basis to more C-level executives and talks to them about talent. And so today I want to talk to you about that. And I think my very first question is, what are the best leaders worried about?
It's such a great question because I think, to be honest, they're worried about the wrong things. So if I go, what are the best leaders worried about? They're deeply worried about whether the structures of their organizations are ready for the complexity of talent issues that they have to deal with. So I think all leaders, executive leaders, are probably focused on the right things, which is that we know that they're prioritizing digital transformation. We know that they're prioritizing talent. So I think they understand there are these big levers that are really important for the growth of their businesses, or at least to manage the threats to that growth. But unfortunately, what I'm finding is that they're thinking about those levers often in potentially the wrong way, and they are exposing themselves to some pretty major threats and risks, I think.
What's the wrong way?
Well, the wrong way, I think, first of all, the most simple version is if you're asking your employees to all come back to the office, I think you're missing the zeitgeist. And so maybe it's helpful to explain what I think is happening in the world and, then...
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so when I'm talking to executives, I'll often start, particularly if it's around the Great Resignation or the Great Reset or whatever talent challenge that they're focusing on, I'll just remind them that pandemics reshape society. So if you go back to the big pandemics, so Black Plague in Europe, essentially what you had there was a European-wide labor shortage. It was caused because so many laborers, like farm hands, lost their lives. And so this labor shortage in Europe ended 300 years of feudalism. It toppled monarchies. It gave birth to modern democracy. And we're living through one of these moments, except this is a global labor shortage. And so it is transforming society as we speak. So we're seeing almost a reversal of globalism. We're seeing supply chains completely being restructured, manufacturing being re-onshored. So all of these things are happening, but also what's happening. And I think if we look back 50 years from now and we say, well, what was the impact of the pandemic? I think the one thing that'll show through for me is that reestablishing our relationship with work itself. That's what we'll look back and go, people changed their relationship with work. And I don't think most executives grasp just how big a thing that is. So the pointy end of it, it's like, I actually like working from home. It allows me to manage my life. It gives me more flexibility. So if you're asking your employees to come back to offices, you're missing the gravity of how society and people are changing. So that's just the pointy end of it, and happy to explore other threads around that.
I think there's two things in there. I often think of it, it's sort of like we've all been wearing wooden clogs for a long time. And then we tried on nice leather shoes and they were comfortable. And now, as long as we were wearing those wooden clogs, we sort of didn't notice. But now that we've tried something else, we do. I've also been thinking lately about how we all sort of walk at different paces and different steps. But what if we all stopped at once and took a step together? It was like the pandemic stopped the march and then we all took a step forward together. There's an amplification of that moment.
Absolutely. And not only are we all doing it together, because the pandemic forced us to shrink our world, we're doing that with the people that we care the most about. And we're doing it in a moment of existential crisis where we are reminded of our mortality. We're reminded of how short our time is on earth and how important the people close to us are. And so not only is it a collective moment like you described, but it's a particularly human moment that's reminding us we are humans. And I think that's the big lesson, is that maybe for 300 years, but at least the last 50 years, executive leaders have thought about employees as assets, sometimes not even assets. They've thought about them as widgets to be moved around. They've been thought of as a means to profit. I think more horribly in the last 10 years, they've been seen as a impediment to automation, something to get rid of really quickly. And I think what the pandemic reminded us, it was a human health crisis first, an economic crisis second. We saw the value of nurses and doctors and teachers and delivery drivers and all of those people that are out there that kept us alive during this once in a lifetime or generation pandemic. So what we do know is that workers now see themselves as humans, and they expect their organizations to see them as humans and to treat them that way. I don't think the average senior executive has caught up to that fact, and they're not quite seeing humans as humans just yet.
Yeah. And you know my position on this. I'm going to restate it here, which is that I believe that employees are customers, that workers are customers, as opposed to being inputs to production. And that because we've missed the fact that they're customers, we have misjudged the moment. And we've done this before, by the way. We misjudged it when all of a sudden people started developing Linux. And we said, how is this possible? They're not being paid. And it just took us completely by surprise that people could just go out and do that. And that's because we misunderstood what people really want from work. It's not just pay. And the thing about customers is the word customer comes from the word custom or habit. When it was coined in 1409, it meant habit. And if you break the habit of your customer, you can lose them. And I think that's what's happened here to some extent, which is that we've lost the habit of certain things that we didn't know we didn't like.
And I guess inherent in or central to what you've just shared, rightly or wrongly, we think of the customer comes first. Now, if we think about employees as customers, almost by definition, we have to put them first. And that is really challenging to almost all of the foundational tenets of the way that we do business. It's a massive shift and a massive transformation, but one that I think is inevitable. And the thing that I often use to demonstrate this with clients is to say, there's a whole generation of people that are being conditioned to the Netflix experience. And I describe the Netflix experience as, if you've ever accidentally signed into your partner's Netflix account or profile, I should say, it can be a viscerally shocking experience because you learn things about them that you didn't know. So, for example, my wife is absolutely fascinated by serial killers. I never knew. And so the point of that is to say that if we think about employees as customers or consumers, their experience today is one of a hyper personalized experience. So you don't just take every customer and give them the same experience because you know that will break the custom, right? So the custom today is that you get to experience that product or service in a way that is unique to you. It's catering to your requirements and your preferences, and there are complex algorithms out there designed to understand that at the smallest detail possible. If we were to take that approach with our employees, not only would we create these incredible employee experiences, but why would you leave a company that understands you? Back earlier in my career, I worked for a software company, and it was a software company that made management software for hair salons. And it gave me some of the biggest lessons I'd ever learned about customers. And that is that the hairdressing industry, it's all about understanding your customer. How do they like their coffee? They will take pictures of the last 7 years of haircuts that their customers have had. They know what the name of their dog is. They know how many kids they've got. They know what movies they like. And the whole model is when that person enters into that salon, that they enter into an experience that is just for them. And I learned that, 20 years ago now, almost. And to me, I'm starting to see that model being adopted by every organization. So the next logical evolution is that that's the way we're going to have to think about employees.
If I'm a leader in an organization and you just told me that, what would my reaction be? I think my reaction would be, first of all, that sounds really, really hard. It sounds expensive. I'm not sure I'm equipped to do it.
Yeah, you raise such a great point. And I think most of the challenges we see is you have to bring people on a journey. So I would first remind them that we felt exactly the same way with the emergence of customer experience. What do you mean? I have to write a different letter to every customer? I can't just use a mail merge program? Do you mean I have to actually have a customer relationship management database to hold all of this information? And so what I would remind them is that, some of the most successful organizations in the world today are the ones that have mastered the customer experience journey. It can be done.
Something that I don't know that anybody has right now is a customer management solution that faces toward employees.
We do. I'm not sure that they're great. They're called an HRIS.
Honestly, those are inventory systems.
Exactly.
The truth is that as long as the workforce's inputs to production, almost everything we have is about procurement and maintenance of that input. And all of our metaphors for how we think about the workforce are about supply chain or something like that. And so what should I know about you if I'm managing that file that you talked about me at the salon and you work for me?
I think this really gets to the heart of it. And I often reflect on previous times. So some of your listeners may be old enough to remember the VHS versus Betamax. I think this might be one of those moments, right? So one way we can understand the customer is to collect enormous amounts of data on them. So if we apply that to employees, at some point we're going to have to ask them to give us that information. I think that's going to be problematic because if my employer starts asking me how I like to have my coffee, I'll be like, well, yeah, okay. Like, does that mean you're going to give me free coffee? Maybe I'll sign up for that. I'm not sure. But there's also things like privacy legislation, particularly being enacted in areas like the European Union, that might actually prevent organizations from collecting all of that data. If I was going to take the Betamax version, probably let the cat out of the bag a little bit there, I would say, what do I want to know about an employee if I'm thinking of them as a customer? The first thing is like, what do they want to do with their life? What is their life about? Like, what is their purpose as a human being on this planet? And who are they connected to? And why are those connections important to them? Then I'd probably want to know what they like doing. So what are the tasks they enjoy that gives them energy, that motivates them? And then I'd want to know what they're good at. I'd be less interested in their qualifications, although maybe vaguely interested. I'd be much more interested in what they can do and what they can deliver. Yeah, so you can start to see what type of inventory you might be able to build in that back end, in that let's call it an employee relations database, for want of a better term.
I'll tell you, you're right about that bit about people not wanting to share data with the company, which is that it's been a strange experience to me wanting to build internal resume databases that everybody will share publicly on LinkedIn, everything about themselves, but they won't actually share it with their company. When you actually ask people to adopt an internal resume system, 70% of everybody says no.
You know what, though? When you make that switch and you think about employees as customers, right? We would not ask our customers to fill out a form to give us information that we should already know about them. So the first thing I'd say is, hey, LinkedIn's a thing. Like, I've already put it there. You go find it. Why are you making me do the work for you? And whenever I'm confronted with an organization that's trying to sell me something and they make me do the work, I'm out. It's like, no, that's your job. So that's the first lesson, is that data collection needs to be effortless. It's not something that I, as the employee, should be putting any effort into. It's all out there. You can find it. That's what really makes me think that data collection, building a customer relationship management solution to this is not going to work. What I think is more going to work, which is more aligned to how we sell products, right, is that the onus is on the organization to sell the work, to market the work. And then the customer, as either an active or a passive part of that relationship, will either buy the product or not. This is the big shift. It's like, in a world where the balance of power has shifted towards the employee, we might have to start, as organizations, doing the work. And when I mean doing the work, I mean selling the work to the employee and doing all of the work that is required to make that happen.
Yeah, one of the things I think about when it comes to scaling the idea of employees as customers is the role of the manager, which is, that's where a lot of the scale comes from. And I think it needs to change the intelligence of managers and the focus of managers to be able to develop the kind of compassion, the kind of human connection to the people on their team so that they know what they really want.
Absolutely. And we're seeing that in the data. For a long time, we understood the notion that people leave managers, not companies. Now, for a short period of time, that changed. People were actually leaving companies and they didn't care so much about managers. But then the pandemic came. And so your experience with the company when you're sitting in your home working, actually it's the manager that is the company. And so that's really come back to the fore. But the other part about that is that in a world where work is going to be increasingly virtual for knowledge workers at the very least, the work is all you've got. So the work starts to become really important. Like, we used to be able to rely on culture or the office vibe or the office itself. You know, let's build a campus, like foosball tables and 24-hour cafeteria. None of that matters if you're not going into the office. And what you're left with is however many hours of work. And that starts to become super important.
That's really a really interesting point, which is, I don't know how to put it exactly, but there's no environment anymore. One of the leaders I was talking to recently said that they were very worried because that their company had built and invested heavily in an on-premise experience. And that on-premise experience was partially, it was a sunk cost that they were really scared of losing. Like, oh, did we waste all that? The second thing, though, was this idea of, if we lose that branded experience, do we then become a commodity? In other words, we've just been commoditized.
That's what's happening. Like, that's the whole point of this conversation. Is you're absolutely right. Like, employers are a dime a dozen. And guess what? Their employee value propositions all sound the same. And they're all offering the same environment. But this is where I love to really squeeze the juice out of this problem, because let's think about the office. Even if it is the best campus ever built, there's one thing that will divide at least 50% of your employees, and that's the temperature of the air conditioning. So here I am talking to you in my home office, and I've got the temperature set exactly how I like it. Not only that, I've got a cat sitting under my feet purring, which is really lovely. I'm not wearing pants. Your listeners probably don't need to know that, but they're sitting there exactly the same, right? And I've got a widescreen monitor. I've got all of the equipment I need. Now, I'm going to go into our office next week and I'm going to take my laptop with me and I'm going to battle through traffic and I'm going to get in there and somebody I know is going to ask me to read a spreadsheet. And if you've ever tried to read a spreadsheet on a laptop screen, like it's a difficult task. And our work is done like this now. It is done through these virtual channels. So when I'm in that office, I'm going to be talking through my laptop's inbuilt microphone and listening to the other person through inbuilt speakers, none of which is optimized for this virtual experience. Part of the problem is that an office is designed for the lowest common denominator. And there's not a single customer in the world that I know that wants to see themselves as the lowest common denominator.
It was one of the weirdest things when I first started working in a corporation for the very, very first time that I couldn't believe the low standards of design of the workplace. It's a fascinating mystery. You know what? Even good ones. You know what it reminds me a little bit of is when people started building home theaters that were better than the theater. Better chairs, better sound, better TV. Guess what? Nobody's crinkling the wrapper next to you or talking. And all of a sudden, the theaters, they have a purpose. People still go to the theater, but it's not because it's a good place to go.
It's such a wonderful example. One of the rare things I did for myself during the pandemic was I reconnected with cinema. Because I'd become one of those people that, I build home cinema, right? It's better because I don't like people. I'm kidding. Right? But I don't like them when they're talking through a movie. If only I could convince my wife not to, but that's another challenge. But what I fell in love with was that this cinema down the road from my house started showing classic films. And I'm a huge classic sci-fi buff. And so I got to watch Blade Runner and Star Wars and Alien. And it became this incredible experience. Now, that's how we should treat the office. A moment of ceremony, of what's the word I'm looking for? Nostalgia, of connection. So if we start going, the work doesn't need to be done in the office. What needs to be done there is an event, something with pomp and ceremony and all of the trappings. Because I think I often laugh. I was an early Napster adopter, so you'll probably know where I land on this side of the coin. But I used to laugh at the idea that piracy was killing cinema. And I was like, no, people are killing cinema. So to that point, we don't want to be surrounded by people all day. It's hard to work in a rowdy open plan office. But you know what? Sometimes I just really like to get together and connect with people that share the same work that I do. And we can make that happen in really meaningful ways. I love that idea of cinema. I'm going to steal it. That'll be the new way that I talk about things.
What I told this leader who was worried about losing that on-prem brand was that they should start thinking about not as though they have one work experience product, but that they have a product line.
Exactly.
I worked for Cisco Systems, and they sold very high-end video teleconferencing, high-definition equipment. One of the things I thought about when I was leaving there is, I got to leave it was gorgeous, high-definition, great sound, and I knew I was leaving that behind and that I was going to have to go into an office. I still did it.
And I guess not everyone wants or needs that high definition experience either, right? Some people are just happy to listen to a average set of speakers or whatever it might be. And I do think there's an analogy for that in work, in the sense of some people will want that campus experience. And so my advice to those companies that want to make the office the center of their world is that, well, you're going to have to create this incredible experience, because you've limited the kind of size of your talent pipeline just because more people have a preference not for that than a preference for it. But there's a market for that. There's also a market for working from home fully. Some people will want to do that. There's a market for hybrid, but there's also going to be a market for work from anywhere, which I love these models, which is one company I know, they're going to give their digital talent round the world plane ticket at the beginning every year and just say, go work from anywhere. As long as it's got decent IT infrastructure and you can get the work done, we don't care. There's going to be new versions of the expat model. So rather than uprooting your entire family and moving to a new location, you continue to work from your home location, but you come to an exciting location for 8 weeks a year. You bring your family with you. You make it an event. So I think that's kind of part of this, is there are markets and you have to approach each of those markets differently. And each of those markets will have its own value proposition And the good companies that I think the ones that have the scale will create multiple markets.
Yeah, they'll have product lines. And then there are others who are going to have to say, I can't afford to have product lines, but I'm going to be the best in the world at serving this vertical, this population.
That's exactly right. I go back to that question that you posed before. If you're talking to an executive and it sounds really expensive and really hard, I'd say, you know how to do this. You've got it. You've done it before. In fact, it's integral to the way that you do business.
I would go farther. I would say that the way you've approached the workforce in the past as an input to production has forced you use psychology as the tool to understand the workforce. That is a really hard path.
Yeah, well, I'm a psychologist, and it's a roundabout way of getting to places.
Well, it is because, and this is the example I use all the time, which is I like this mug. This is actually one of my favorite mugs. Why do I like it? It has this nice sort of silky texture. It's not just glossy. Well, you'd have to dig really deep into my psyche before you could predict that.
Yeah.
What I want from this particular product. And I always buy mugs that look like this, but all you got to do is ask me. You don't have to know anything about my psychology. Just ask me what I want or watch what I buy and give me that. And so the truth is this idea that the old way of doing talent was easy is wrong.
It is super hard.
And I would also argue, and this is going to make me so unpopular, the question is, well, where am I going to get the budget to actually create this customer experience? And I'm going to say that we've reached a point of diminishing returns on traditional HR, and that there are parts of traditional HR that have to do with where we spend a lot of money trying to create this input to production, which we could actually repurpose.
Yeah, totally.
Job role, like every company I've been at has some team that's working on defining the job roles in the company so that we can slot people into those job roles and we can give them targets for how they need to grow. And then we tell everybody to become the same who's in that job role. And I'm not sure it produces value. It costs a lot. And I think there's a whole lot of efforts like that we could repurpose.
Yeah, and it goes back to that VHS versus Betamax approach. One approach is that you map all of the jobs and you create the job families and then you run all of that talent management systems off the back of that. Whereas there's another model, which is you just say, hey, here's a bunch of work that we need to get done. There's one company I know, it's kind of cool. It's a mining company. So this isn't knowledge workers. This is blue collar workers. And they've got a problem with overtime, as many mining companies do, which is that there's more work to be done than you've got people to do it. And it creates the need for overtime. But if you offer overtime too much, it becomes really costly and then it becomes an expectation. So these companies are always trying to manage overtime, right? And so we were discussing, what if you had like a Uber model where you just kind of go, here's all of the work that we need done. And there's some really critical work. Like there's some stuff on a hard timeline and it's going to be really important that we get this done. Well, surge price it. And so if I'm the employee and I'm sitting there going, you know what, I'm really exhausted. I don't feel like taking this on. The money's not quite worth it to me. I can opt out. But there might be somebody sitting there to go, yeah, I have worked more than I wanted to this week, but you know what? I really want to buy this car. So that surge pricing sounds pretty good to me right now. And you don't have to predict who can do the work because you can just set the criteria. And it's like, don't sign up if you can't do it. And I think we have to get much better at trusting our customer, in this case, trusting the employee to make those decisions for us rather than these incredibly complex tools that we put together to it's almost like trying to read tea leaves or divine something. And it's never going to be as accurate as people deciding for themselves. Now, there's a margin of error there. Every now and again, you get somebody who's deluded and they just don't realize the limitations of their own capability. Well, test for that then. Don't do it at the front at the beginning.
I'm going to have a guest on pretty soon, and I don't know if they're going to show up before this interview in the sequence or after this interview in the sequence. A guy named James C. Scott. And he's written a book called Weapons of the Weak and another book which is Seeing Like a State. And he talks about how the upper part of a government, for instance, and the people both hold each other in contempt. Well, and in Weapons of the Week, he talks a lot about how, what are the tools of the week? Well, mockery is one of the tools of the week.
Yeah.
Which when you look at late night TV, it's a whole industry is mocking the powerful. I'm wondering if this part about trust, is there a perception of the workforce that underestimates the workforce.
Absolutely. I mean, I could get deeply philosophical around this, but I mean, I do think that democracy is, particularly for those of us in this part of the world, obviously, I'm from Australia, we have the Westminster system, it's an adversarial system. So a lot of the way that we've set up our political and social structures, I think, are adversarial, and they are based on lack of appreciation for what people actually can bring to the table. So there's a degree of intellectual snobbery, there's classism. I could keep talking about these kind of social structures. But if I bring it back to work, yeah, senior leaders in organizations don't trust employees to work. I mean, we're seeing it now, right? And we've just been through the biggest experiment in work in probably its entire history. And maybe for your listeners, I took my first call on remote work from our clients in Wuhan in China in probably almost to the day, this time 2 years ago in 2020. And they called up and they said, we've got this strange disease. It's highly contagious and we have to send all of our people home to work remotely. We've never done it before. What do we do? No one had an answer, right? But what I can tell you is that like some 1,800 conversations later with companies of every part of the world, every type of response to that problem that we could see, the thing that we still know is that leaders still do not trust that people can work from home unobserved. And yet, organizations, aside from those directly impacted by the pandemic in terms of their markets like aviation, et cetera, most organizations experienced record profit, record productivity. They achieved about 10 years of digitalization in the space of 2 years. So what did workers actually do? They went home and they worked harder. So the biggest concerns we have is not that they're not productive or that they're like lying on the beach instead of going to work. It's that they're working so hard that they're killing themselves. That's what we're worried about. The first point I'd make is there's two things about this. One is that we've proven that employees can be trusted. And in fact, I often paint this picture. There was this beautiful period, at least in Australia, between the months of March and May, where everyone went home to work and they finally found themselves with lots of space and time because they weren't commuting and they weren't going into offices and they weren't being disrupted. And it was particularly quiet and productive because managers were still trying to work out how to run a meeting virtually. And so we had this period of about a month, almost 2 months of no meetings. And I would argue that that is probably one of the most enjoyable and productive periods of most people's careers. Then the managers came back. Then the meetings came back. Then the monitoring came in. And so what went from actually an enjoyable, highly productive period of work became this 12-hour Zoom call, which created all sorts of problems that we're still now dealing with. So there's two things. One is, yes, employees can be trusted and the data has told us that they can. Secondly, they're way more capable of transforming than we ever gave them credit for because they learned how to work in a completely different way within 48 hours. They mastered multiple new systems. They worked out how to use VPNs. In essence, they digitalized themselves and they did it faster than the people leading them. And to this day, senior executives are still the people that are having the most problems with being on a Zoom call. Yeah, it's a myth that hasn't just been busted, it's been exploded and exposed for the empty myth that it always was.
It really makes me wonder how many other myths we hold that are like that. Maybe we don't need a pandemic to test.
I know. You'd hope that we don't need a pandemic.
You've been looking into the anti-work movement. How would you characterize it?
Well, the first thing I'd say is they've got a branding issue because it's not anti-work. People love work. I mean, it's not all champagne. We'd call it play or fun, not work. So, I mean, work does contain that notion that there's some challenge in it. So I don't think the anti-work movement is anti-work. It's anti-exploitation. Let's just call it for what it is. What people are rejecting is being treated poorly. And there's just story after story of people being treated with disrespect, their time not being respected, the horror stories of people being expected to come to work on the same day that they've lost a family member to COVID. That's not how human beings treat each other. So the anti-work movement to me is just nothing more than people reclaiming their humanity. That's all it is.
Yeah. After I knew that you had been looking to it, I started looking into it. And what I expected to see there was sort of I don't know what to say, whining?
Yeah.
Or sort of unrealistic ideas of.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, my manager looked sideways at me.
So first of all, I will say most of the people I was seeing in the anti-work blogs were not the people I normally work with. And the reason is that I work in high tech and I work the high end of high tech. And so everybody I work around is sort of they're at diminishing returns on income. But what I saw in anti-work was a lot of people who were lower in terms of income, and they were at this boundary between simply working 60 hours a week and not making enough money to live. There's a lot of that.
Yeah.
I don't blame anybody for feeling really bad about that.
Yeah.
And wanting to get on there and talk about it.
And I think not only is that horrible at the micro level, at that individual level, but the threat that that creates at the macro level to functioning democratic societies is something that we should be taking incredibly seriously. In a system like capitalism, which really is built on aspiration, when you work 60 hours and you still can't pay your rent, yet alone save up for college, yet alone aspire to wear a suit and maybe educate yourself to get something that pays more, that's the removal of hope. And hope is absolutely critical for aspiration. And for those of us that are in charge of organizations, you can't grow without aspiration and you can't aspire without hope. And so if we want to continue our growth stories, we're going to have to re-find the hope. And we're going to have to remind people that there is a pathway from poverty to aspiration and to something better. Essentially, there are corporations today that pay people so little that they also partner with organizations to provide information to those employees about how to access food stamps. Now, if part of your strategy as an organization is to educate your workers about how to get food stamps, you are not paying your people enough.
Right. One of the most incapacitating things is, I was going to say learned helplessness, but it's really learned hopelessness is really the word, right?
It's hopelessness. Yeah.
There's taught hopelessness.
Absolutely.
And so let me ask this last question. I've asked hundreds of people this question. What job do you, Aaron, hire your job to do for you?
A few things, although it's changing. And this is an important lesson, right? Is that your life changes. So what I might say is my job was mostly about giving me an avenue to see the world and have adventure. I just had a job where I was traveling all of the time and I got to go to these exotic locations and see parts of the world and experience different cultures on the company dime, so to speak. It was a lovely arrangement. So that was a really important part of it. The other one was I'm a lapsed musician, a lead singer of a band. And so my job gave me a stage that I was too old and uncool to be on anymore. So I could still be a little bit of a rock star in an entirely different way.
And may I say, you are actually a rock star in the circles that I move in, which is that you have a famous stage presence as a speaker. And so, yeah, that's a real thing.
Yeah, and I guess, I haven't always been conscious of that, but I've come to realize that that was a huge part of why I do the work that I do. There's another part though, and I guess a lot of that has come out on this call, which is I've always been interested in social justice at a very deep level. And I do recognize that I have a platform and a voice, and I can use that for change. So I went through a period in my life where I studied psychology, but I first studied journalism. And I wanted to be a journalist because I wanted to change the world. And then I realized it's really hard to change the world. So I thought maybe I can change the world one person at a time. So I went into psychology. And now I find myself back in another place where I'm actually much more confident about my ability to change the world one executive at a time. And I think that's actually an incredibly important part of why I do the work that I do, which is that I have access to people who determine the lives of millions of people. That's a powerful way to institute change. What I'd say today is that it's probably more about having the stage and having the platform and a little bit less about the travel, although I still love it. But, I have 2 young kids now. And so work is also about allowing me to be with them and to be the best father that I can be.
What's interesting about that is I was going to ask you the design of your job today. Is it doing what you need? How would we design it better? It's interesting that you may have discovered in your job a reward that you might not have known when you started it.
It's kind of funny. When I first was exposed to this job as a potential, it was a client of mine who just said, "Hey, Aaron, do you know anyone that could do this?" And he sent me through this job description. And I called him up and I said, "Is this bullshit? Like, this looks like a made up job." And my wife's a recruiter, so I'm aware that sometimes recruiters will invent a job just to pull talent out of the woodwork. And I was like, "Is it one of those?" And he goes, "No, it's like, it's you, Aaron. Like, that's your job." So I kind of did know at the earlier stages of joining this company that there was a job that I didn't think was real that just felt like it was kind of handmade for me. I'm not saying it's like a perfect job, and every organization goes through changes and things. Like, it was like I'd seen a fairy tale written out, and that's how I thought it was. That was my immediate response to it.
That's fantastic. I think we should have a lot more stories like that.
Well, maybe to put a bow on our conversation, that's the opportunity today, is that organizations now actually have the ability to send that fairy tale very targeted to the person, and their response, "Are you kidding? It sounds like you totally know me."
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're talking about. And we have both the technology and we have the means to make that happen today. And that has the potential to revolutionize the world. And I'll go back to that point I made about why I do what I do. It's about footprint. So I know that senior executives control the working lives of millions of people. And if one employee's life at work is better, they have a better relationship with their partner, with their children, with their community, and that ripple just keeps going. Work is so central to the human condition. And if we can make it work for people, oh, what a gift. And that's every executive. You've got the opportunity to hand that gift to somebody.
And you know what? It's a great place to end the conversation. I believe that the leaders of companies want to be that kind of hero in the world.
Who doesn't?
And don't know how. And that's what we're going to learn next. Thank you. Great conversation.
That was super fun. That was just the breadth, the authenticity. There was not a moment in there where I felt like I was geez, I'm stepping too close to the edge here. Didn't feel like that at all, even though it was provocative.
Thanks for being here today.
My pleasure. This has been a highlight of my year already, so thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.